In my talk, I just want to say a couple of words in solidarity with uh, Palestinian people and also those precious lives that we lost in Hamas's attack. Uh, Innocent people, kids, non-competent people. There is no justification to do that. And at the same time, we need to recognize the power imbalance in this conflict. And all we can do as academics in our classes, depending on the context that we are in. I just wanted to put that out. So my talk it's not a very academic talk in a sense that I conducted some research and now I want to present some findings. I have just some questions and concerns, some experiences that I want to share with you and then get your experiences, your feedback, your thoughts, and see how do you think about this issue. So first, let me say that by this presentation, I don't intend to undervalue the work that ethics committees do, but at the same time, it's a critical approach to what I have been experiencing. And but at the same time, even though it's my experience, I kind of tend to say that this is somewhat general. It's not just me, but we will know based on other people's experiences. So the first assumption that I have is that more or less universities nowadays are primarily financial institutions instead of educational institutions, and this has implications for research. More specifically, when we send our ethics protocol to ethics committee. If the university is a financial institution, then it means that the economic logic dominates the decisions made by universities, more or less also when it comes to research ethics. And that means the university and the research committee tends to protect its reputation or have a better reputation to get more students, to earn more money, and protecting this reputation and protecting the face of the university and the research committee means that if we want to conduct research on some issues that are political, especially in the repressive context, may upset a large group of students that pay money to the university, pay tuition to the university. And because of that, it's not only the ethics or the morality of the research that members of the committee take into account. They also worry about the face of the university if the general public or potential students know that a given topic got approved by the ethics committee and the university. So that's one consideration. Even though the name of the committee is the ethics committee, but I think it masks some other considerations that ethics committee take into account when they review a protocol. The second issue is the political correctness that these days we see in universities. And I give you an example to make it more concrete, the way in which I understand it. Let's say that I want to do a research about problems within Muslim communities. It's extremely hard to get the ethics approval because no doubt that we have Islamophobia in Western countries, no doubt about that. But at the same time, I should be able to conduct some research when women in some Muslim communities are oppressed because they don't want to wear hijab or because they don't fit the dominant narrative within the Muslim community. But again, it's extremely hard, at least based on my experience and some of my friends, to get the ethics approval for this type of research, because sometimes they think that it's not politically correct to conduct these types of research. The other problem that I had with ethics committee is the composition of the ethics committee. Who are the members of these committees? Most of the time, they are white people that do not have enough knowledge about the context that we want to research. For example, I want to conduct research by Iranian participants or Lebanese participants, but because they don't know the context, they cannot have a sound, rational, and good evaluation of the way in which I'm going to conduct the research, of the questions that I can or cannot ask, and all the rest of it. So there is this issue of representation. If we have someone that are familiar with the context, that'd be much better. And then there is this idea of, even if they have someone representing the community, then we have different factions in the community. Which faction is representing the community? We have that problem too. I mean, it's much more detailed. And then I talked about the knowledge of the context, about the norms, for example. The other thing is about the participants' safety and risk. So this is very important, obviously, because we don't want to put people's safety at risk, obviously, and they have every right to be worried about that. That's extremely important, specifically in repressive context. But at the same time, we want to know what safety means in those contexts. In fact, we cannot have a sweeping opinion about what does it mean to conduct a risky research, or what does it mean to protect participants' safety, and have the idea that if we understand safety in the context of the United States or in Canada in this way, we should understand it and apply the same standard in other contexts. It's not, I think, applicable. It's not justifiable, I think. For example, I have friends, students in my country, Iran, that they are ready to take the risk to conduct the research. And the risk might be going into prison, or I don't know, getting noticed by the authority. And they are ready to do that. So who is, or who are the research committees to say that, oh, you cannot do this because it's risky for them? It's patronizing. It's a very colonial approach to research, I think, especially considering our background. And understandably, most members of research ethics committees are risk averse. They have a risk averse approach to ethics, and sometimes, not always, sometimes it doesn't help us as researchers because they most of the time consider the worst case scenario: not getting sued, not getting a bad reputation, being careful to attract the most number of students that they possibly can, and all the rest of it. So in that sense, being risk averse is not good for research. And one of the consequences of that, which is ironic, is that who's enjoying the freedom of speech in Western countries? I can say, at least in some cases, this is the regime supporters that are here. Those are the ones who can say anything, a lot of things that they want, and they are protected by the freedom of research. which in a lot of cases I agree with the fact that they should be able to say those things. In some cases, maybe they shouldn't, but that's for, I don't know, a court to decide, not me. But at the same time, we, the researchers who want to conduct research about those things that promote social justice, promote awareness, and stuff like that, we cannot do that. Why? Because the ethics committee is so conservative that we cannot conduct the research. And at the same time, those people who are regime supporters, they have their megaphones on, they can say whatever they want, and you know the rest. So it's ironic that we cannot do our job and benefit the freedom of speech while those people who support a repressive regime can do that. And the other issue is the subjective decision making. Sometimes you send a protocol to the ethics committee, you don't get it, and then the members of the committee change, then you can get it. Or you submit a protocol to a university, you cannot get the approval. Another university, you can get it. So we have this problem of different standard, or this standard is the same, criteria is the same, but the way in which the members of the ethics committee apply those standards are different and subjective, open to interpretation. And there is this issue that if we want to conduct some research on ethics committee, and I have some examples for that, can we escape the repercussions? Is there any repercussions? Which is? And then there is this issue of power balance, obviously, and inflexibility of the ethics committee, that when they decide something, for most of the time, at least based on my experience, they tend not to change their decision, or they discuss with you the decisions, but it's just a procedural thing. They really don't mean to engage in a constructive dialogue in order to maybe change their decision. It's just a procedure that they want to follow. And at the end of it, they want to be able to say that, oh, you know what, we heard the other party's arguments, but we decide not to give the approval. Or maybe we need some arbiter, a third party, I don't know. And finally, there are a couple of research topics that we can conduct, and I want your opinion on that. I wanted to do some of these topics, but I was advised by a senior researcher that if you want to do these, you will suffer the consequences, and your work, your future may be in jeopardy. Anyway, sending one protocol to different ethics committee, or sending one protocol to different ethics committee within just one university, or surveying ethics committees on their composition, who are the members, or surveying researchers' problem with ethics committees. I don't know about you guys. I haven't had the chance to hear from the larger community, or surveying members of ethics committee on their issues. Most of the time, they don't get paid. They are so busy. They have their problem too. So it wouldn't be fair to just look at the issue only from our perspective. We need to know some of the power dynamics or other dynamics that they situated in relation to the people like the managers and those people who are above them. Or being a members of ethics committee as a separate job. Maybe that would be a solution to that. I don't know. So these are some of the concerns, thoughts that I have had for a while, and I wanted to share them with you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nima. And this was obviously meant as a discussion starter. So Maybe before we dive into the discussion, I'll share again our Jamboard link so we can just take some time to collect some thoughts, think about it a bit. And there are two sides on that board. One is for just kind of reflections, or maybe you can also share an experience you had with this regard with ethics committees, and the other side is for questions you would like to discuss. You can weave in some of the questions you shared earlier, but maybe we can all just take 5 minutes or so to brainstorm a bit and then see what we have and start the discussion. And the second part of the discussion will be reserved for thinking about solutions, ways forward, practical things we can do.
Can I also just add that if we have any questions or comments about ethical issues more broadly, that we can also discuss that as well. It doesn't have to be specifically on ethics committees.
Johanna, I don't know if it's just me. I opened the Jamboard, but it's on view only mode. I just wanted to make sure that other people don't have the same issue. Maybe it's just me, I don't know.
I don't know either. I thought I set it to anyone can edit. Can someone try
Okay. Okay.
putting a note? But I don't know
I
if
just tried. I don't know how to write into it. Doesn't seem to allow, well, I've never used this before,
Oh,
so I
okay.
don't know what the button is that allows you.
James, do you see any blue button on top right of your screen says view only or edit?
No, it seems it's working. So it's just a matter
Okay.
of how to actually let me share the screen for a moment and we can look at it together. So on the sides, there are little sticky notes that you can use. That's one way of doing it. You just click on the sticky note and then you can type something in. Another
Okay.
option is text box. Either of those work.
Okay. Okay. So I don't know how to do it. Okay. Thank you, Johanna.
You can also just share something in the chat and someone else can put it on the board. There's nothing holy about the board, but Okay, I think I'm gonna just get rid of the reflection side of the board because there are clearly more questions. It's getting crowded. Yeah, feel free to move things around if you see a similar question. All right, we have lots of good stuff on the board, a few clusters. Is there any place anyone would like to start? Would anyone like to nominate a cluster of questions that we can start our discussion with from the board or also beyond the board?
It seems that some of the questions concerns the risk and safety of participants.
Right, like actual safety and risk as opposed to what the IRB may think the risk is.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we can start there. How do we keep our participants safe? Or is that, in ways that are not also exacerbated by the IRB's requests, right? Oftentimes IRBs insist on consent forms and very detailed documentation, which makes sense in many cases, but in this case may actually be counterproductive and make it riskier, right? If their IRBs are reasonable, then I think oftentimes they may step back from those kinds of requests and instead have oral consent, for example. But then the question is still, what are the procedures through which we can keep participants safe in repressive contexts? Or also building on your earlier point about paternalism, that's another thing I often think about with IRB comments, kind of them assuming that people living in that context aren't very well aware of what they're getting into if they decide to participate, right? So
That's right. That's right. And the other assumption, it's at least the behavior is that. I don't know about the perception. The behavior is that they don't trust the researcher. I mean, the comments and the expectation from the ethics committee is like, we are not on the same team. It's us versus them. And they don't trust us. And we need to prove to them that the safety of participants are important to us. I don't know where that come from, but that's another issue.
I'll also add to that, and this comes from the experience with a project where there are a bunch of people here on that project, so they can speak more about it. Um, but I think another issue with submitting an IRB application in sort of a Western institution when you want to do research in more repressive contexts is that the original logic of IRB is to ensure that participants are protected to the extent possible. And I think IRBs currently think of it much more sort of self-centeredly. They want to protect themselves. And that can result in sort of ridiculous statements asking you to like change the repression. So not understanding that the zero level of risk in a repressive context is different from the zero level of risk in a more democratic place. So it feels sometimes like the comments of the IRB are, well, first, transition the country into a democracy and then you can do this research, because otherwise the participants there will not be safe. And well, of course, they're not safe. That's why we're doing the research.
Right.
So I phrased that on the Jamboard as also their inability, I think, to fully see the equation for both the risks and the benefits. When some of us decide to do this research is because we think that this can bring something important to the table. And I think they don't have that part of the equation. They just see the risks which are inherent in living in a more repressive society.
That's right.
Not very useful.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's one issue, not understanding the minimum risk in repressive context. And the other issue, as I said, is that some people are willing to take the risk. It's okay with them. And it seems that the psychology in ethics committee in Western countries, I mean, generally speaking, I don't know, does not understand it, does not appreciate it. I don't know why. Some people are simple as that. Some people are ready to risk themselves, their freedom, sometimes their life, to conduct the research. I mean, it's extreme, the life. But that's the whole idea.
Can I kind of make a slightly counter point here? Here, I kind of do understand. I found that I work in China quite a bit, which is a becoming a more and more repressive context. Now, as somebody who's outside of that context, I find that I self-censor quite significantly because I don't want to endanger my colleagues. I'm not talking about participants, I'm talking about colleagues, because if you say the wrong thing at the wrong time, that they're going to come down on you and you're going to be gone. And there's going to be no questions asked. So for me, I feel like there's a personal ethics of me as a researcher, and for that person, first of all, they need to know what the odds are. And as you're saying, sometimes people really are willing. And I know one person who was willing, but not as willing as he thought he would be, because he ended up, in the process of losing his job for doing something that wasn't explicitly critical, but was kind of critical. So he ventured into that gray zone that many repressive contexts have. So China is not a rule of law country, it's a rule of policy country. So you have to know as a researcher what the policy is and dance. So for me, the flip side is the research I do, I just don't see it as quite important enough to risk lives and livelihood, especially when I myself am safe from this. You see what I'm saying? So I feel like I don't have the right to go in there because, I'm very involved, but I am just a visitor there. I'm not living in that context. So I guess those are my reflections. I'd love to see a more agreed set of ethics for people in these privileged democratic contexts, working with people in these non-privileged contexts, because our IRB is so naive. I have students coming from China. To guide our IRB through their ethics in China would be diabolical. they have no idea what's going on, and they try to impose all these kind of things, and they have no idea what the real risks are. It's exactly as you say, but one way that we might do it is just to maintain two affiliations, to just say that the research is going to be done by this university in China. And by the way, the university in China, what they do is their ethics are governed by the Communist Chinese Party. So some member of the Communist Party looks it over, makes sure it's okay before you do it. So I mean, those are the rules. And I don't know how you guys feel like of other repressive contexts, but I'm just learning right now how to navigate that for myself.
I think that is a good example of the fact that even repressive contexts differ from one another. And I think what you just described add a more nuanced understanding of repressive context. And I think it is the duty of the ethics committee to know all those nuances, because they claim that they are, or they have the authority to approve or disapprove the ethics protocol. And if the requirement of approval is knowledge of the context, which I think it is, then it's on them to know the details of the context. I agree with you. Yeah.
If I may, I think also one issue with this is that the ethics boards generally that I've dealt with have been very lacking in awareness, knowledge, expertise, particularly about contexts that are not their own national contexts. And they make no accommodation for the fact that they are lacking in this. So it's not like, they understand, oh, I have no idea what the risks are, or what the considerations might be for this kind of research in this kind of context. So I need to pull in some experts or consult with some people from that context or something like that. No, they just forge ahead using their own standards and their own sort of cultural and institutional and national considerations, which I think is a little bit, ethnocentric, whatever you want to call it, biased in different ways. And it occurs to me, one reason why that might be is that usually there is nobody on that board who can challenge that kind of behavior, because nobody on that board is from anywhere else. So perhaps a lack of breadth in experience and backgrounds in these kinds of boards might be a big part of this small aspect of the problem.
That's right. And the other unfortunate fact, at least again, it's my perception, is that my experience is that universities, instead of being the leader in the society, now they are turning into the follower of the public opinion. Instead of saying that, hey, this is a research, legitimate research, should be conducted based on our standards for reputation, face, money, I don't know, political correctness, whatever you want to call it. They tend to say, oh, no, we don't want to do that because other people might get upset, or so on and so forth. So universities, it seems, that are changing their position from a leader of the society into the followers, unfortunately.
Daboa, please go ahead.
I'll go on camera. Hey everybody, it's good to see folks. And I Nima, is that how you pronounce it?
Nima, that's right.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, but I also think that there's like a lot of nuance to that. Coming from a community organizer background, we know that research is often decades behind what is going on in the public and the grassroots. So when we say following the public, I think it's a little bit different. You know, they've always been behind. And there's a huge criticism that, you know, research has never been at the forefront of the issue. The forefront of the issue is always on the ground. So when you're talking about like the general public, maybe like the media cycle or even the legal, like electoral policy cycle, but what's actually going on in people's communities on the ground, research has always been behind and continues to be
Yes,
behind.
yeah.
In language, in perspective, in approach, in methodology, in rigor, in theory, and all of those things. So I just want to name that I totally get what you're saying, but I think that adding some nuance to that is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally makes sense to me. Yes.
And actually, Jabwa, I know we also have some questions about this on the board or comments, but I'm curious to hear from your experience working with communities, what types of ethical issues they bring up about research other than the issue of extractivism, which is of course a constant, but kind of what from your experience some of the real ethical issues are that they would like to see addressed by us researchers.
Yeah, and for people who there's a lot of people in the room I don't know. So just for context, like I in an academic space through PhDism, but most of my research is at the community level. I work with grassroots organizations, activists, organizers, nonprofits. So I don't necessarily answer to an ethics board anymore, but yet I would argue that the ethics and the values that I lead within my research are at a higher standard than what an ethics board would consider. But it means that there's also permission to move differently. Like the consent forms that I use look very different than the ones that academic institutions will either make you use or approve for you to use. The language is much more about what I can promise as a researcher to participants rather than these are legal protections. It's more about these are my promises to you, this is what you do. And there's also a lot of language, and I put it on the board too, around data ownership. Participants fully own the data. So a lot of the questions are, where's my story going? What does this mean? Why am I giving something where I don't know what's going to happen? So they're, you know, doing things like member checking and ground truthing, giving back the stories and the data. It's not even giving back, but like not even framing it as this is data that I own. It's more like these are stories that I'm holding. This is information that I'm holding, and you're giving me permission to use it in this way. Also ethics is around, like a huge piece is around the analysis and the interpretation. So it's not, consent is not just when we are data collecting, it's also right before publication. So in a lot of the community-based projects that I work with, whether that's survey data, interviews, focus groups, what brings a lot of ease and gets people on is that they know that they're going to be final editors of their own words. So it's not just through my lens and my interpretation. So a lot of the concerns at the community level when engaging in community-based research outside of the academy, a lot of it is the consent form, a lot of it is data ownership, a lot of it is specifically the framing of the stories and the interpretation and what gets released. And that's really like where the piece goes. When it comes to academic institutions, it's really about that first point of contact. That's all they want. You know, the signature, the whatever, that first point of contact, did you agree to be here? You know, that day, did you agree to do this thing? They have no protections to how a story is framed, how people's words are used, how people's data is used, what can happen later. If I was to do a secondary analysis on a data set that I collected in the context I'm at now, I would need, within my ethics, to go back and ask people explicitly if that is available and able to use. I can't collect a bunch of data and then publish 5 different things on it as an academic institution would allow me to. And one of the issues with, you know, how IRBs are set up is in an academic institution, if I was to collect a large data set, I'm almost forced to just do all of those studies without their permission because it's very difficult to then go back to participants and ask them if it's okay. We see, you know, a lot of dangers with that happening in other studies and stuff, but it's not usually paid attention to until that danger does happen. But it's like, what are the conditions that IRBs are forcing people to work in that are actually counter to what participants want and counter to their own comfort, their own stories and the framing? And why should we as researchers trust ourselves with that framing so much that we can't put like structures in our own research that allow us to make sure and to promise them that they have final say in their stories, final say in their framing, along with our analysis and our expertise on the thing. So there's a lot of things there, but it's often about the end point of the research and not so much that touch point that RABs are really focusing on.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's really interesting to hear. And one day I'll hit you up for one of your consent forms. I want to see how they're written. I think this issue of how what narrative, what story will be told is also particularly important when we're talking about research on resistance, right? And how that gets used. Fuad.
Thank you so much, Jaboa, for that. Yeah, I've actually been reading a bit about data sovereignty and the concept of that, and how particularly the Maori have been dealing with issues of how people use data from that community, and it's really raised a lot of questions for me in terms of how we do research in general, but also how we produce research more broadly. And it brought to mind a situation that came up in a project of mine a few years ago, where the researchers had recruited me to be part of their team to collect data for them from a Middle Eastern country, and asked me to gather this data using a consent form that suggested that it was going to be used in a certain way. They published that data using it in the way that they had said, and then they informed me like a year later that they were going to publish using those data on a completely different topic, and using it in a way that I knew some participants would be very uncomfortable with. I objected, and I told them this is not what we had agreed. This is not what the participants had read in the consent form. If they had a chance to say yes or no to you doing this, they would say no. And they completely ignored it, these objections, and I walked out of the project, and they still went ahead and published it. So, you know, for me, the question is, okay, the idea of data ownership is all well and good, but how do you get to a point where people respect that concept, and you get institutions to respect that concept, and who actually ends up enforcing that kind of respect for participants' viewpoints? I mean, we can't really rely on journals to do it, because that would mean slowing down research substantially, which means less, less output, less fees, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I'm just wondering, like, if we want to move forward with this idea of data ownership and data sovereignty, how do we make that a more systemic and normative change?
James?
Yes, I have some replies for you, Fuad. One thing is, I think that it's very challenging if you're working directly with a loose community. I was working with a community group, and that community group was an NGO. And so when we did the ethics, we made sure that they owned the data, which ended up proving incredibly problematic for them because of the Maori data sovereignty issues that you mentioned. So this was absolutely reverse of what was intended. So it's Maori academics that are pushing this Maori data sovereignty that put an incredible burden on an NGO. Those data sovereignty regulations now put an incredible reporting and security burden on the NGO, which would have been completely incapable of doing it. Luckily, with us, it was a tripartite alliance between the NGO and a larger corporation, as a healthcare corporation, that could actually handle the data sovereignty issues. So for me, frontline researcher, I thought the Maori data sovereignty thing is going to shut down a lot of research. And the NGO, by the way, is a Maori Pacific NGO. it's going to shut down a lot of this because they cannot comply with another high-level reporting constraint. The diabolicalness of that Maori data sovereignty stuff, they had a professional programmer. He had to work for months to get this in gear. But anyway, in the end, it was a happy ending because of the alliances, so that now the NGO owns the data. The corporation did the programming that enabled them to do that. And I just asked them for the data on any research subsequently. So that's the long term, because again, I can't stay in touch with them because I'm not a member of the community, but they're members of the community. And that was a really strongly working solution. Anyway, that's just a personal experience. But I think that principle of having a coherent organization own the data is probably the best way to do it. That way you don't put researchers in their compromised position where they want to publish. They have to ask the community for permission. Yeah, thanks. I have to go soon. I've got a next meeting, but thanks very much. And thanks for making this available.
Thanks
to us,
for being with us,
the
James.
Pacific.
Nima, go ahead.
So what time is it? Yeah. I was thinking about some other options, some other ways in which we can conduct research outside of academia, which at least one of the questions was about that. Maybe we can have a journal that that allows for papers to be published without any IRB. If I, as a researcher, am in touch with the community and communicate what I want to do based on our understanding, shared understanding of the topic, the problem, the risks, and all of that. And if participants are okay in that context, we can try and see what would happen. It's just another way of doing research. I mean, look at other, I think it goes into this idea about different cultures. I mean, as long as someone in some cultures, they tell you that I do this, they do that. They don't need a contract, they don't need some legal procedure and all the rest of it. The social relations, the social arrangements in some communities are different than Western ones. So that may be worth a try. I don't know.
This is actually a good segue. It's exactly 6, which means we have exactly the half an hour we wanted to talk about some solutions, right? And I saw that on the board, there were also a few really interesting suggestions. So maybe we can discuss a few of those. So one that I was just looking at is someone wrote, can IRBs, and that kind of links to what you were saying, I think, Nima, can IRBs be more of a crowdsourcing community
Yeah.
peer system as opposed to an institutional protocol? Can we hold each other accountable instead of filling out standardized forms? Or, I think we won't get around filling out standardized forms, unfortunately, but as Jabwa was saying, I think I always tell my students, we need to be more ethical than what the IRB is actually asking us to do, because that's just bureaucracy. But we need to think really thoroughly and deeply about these ethical questions. So yeah, how might that look like? How do we hold each other accountable? How would that inclusion of community members and, right, people who, I think the term they often use is stakeholders, people who have an interest in the outcome of this research, how can they be included? Even if the IRB is not requesting it from us, what can our practice be? I'm also curious to hear what you all yourself do. Jaboa gave some examples, but what are other things people do to be more ethical than what the IRB is asking us to do, less bureaucratic, and doing like real ethics around this type of research?
Yeah, I think the process probably starts way before an IRB, like the stage where you would fill out an IRB. I think if you genuinely approach your research as a sort of collective effort that you're doing with whatever community you're doing it with, and you involve the stakeholders, so to speak, in like what questions are we asking, what project makes sense right now, how do we want to answer it. Yeah, so this is to say that I put that peer suggestion in the Jamboard, and I think I'm also answering myself that it's less about sort of us in this call holding each other accountable, and it's more about realizing that the ethics question is not something that I am responsible for as a researcher towards some group of people that I approach, but more sort of co-creation of like what's useful right now, but also not dangerous, but also kind and whatever. And I don't know how I feel about the culture argument. I think like I would imagine an IRB in Belfast or Canada or wherever or Spain would think that, oh, since I'm Lebanese, I know the culture there, so I know how things work. And there are people in Lebanon that think I am terrible, and that's fine. So I think also to essentialize culture is not necessarily the right starting point, but more really who is this work for? And that's a much smaller group, I think, than culture usually. So if the folks who are most impacted by that and who yeah participate in that get a say. And then structurally, can IRB make space for that? Like, can I say I have a project on this particular topic and those are the folks that I will be doing this project with, and then we co-write this? And I don't think the IRB as it stands right now has any space for that. It wants me as a researcher to say that I've done my due diligence and I am protecting these people, and it doesn't see me as part of the people. So I think that would require a lot of restructuring of how we view these things.
I mean, has anyone here had this experience that got the IRB approval, but the community in which the research was conducted had some problem with the research? And how they communicate?
Yes.
Okay. And just because I'm asking this because maybe knowing that could help us to see how the community can hold us accountable for what we as researchers do. I don't know.
I mean, that's also a big difference between, you know, doing one's research on MTurk or Prolific or actually being out in the community. I mean, when you actually work with participants face to face, they will tell you, right? Like you will,
That's right.
There will be a lot of pushback and people have no issues doing that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm always really skeptical about, right,
Exactly.
the type of research where you never actually interact with participants.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And most of the time, the research that I want to do with Iranian participants is through social media, and I don't have access to them physically. We are not meeting in person. They don't have access to me if it's only online. So it's similar to what you just said. So that's a different dynamic there.
I wonder what I think that's a very real like barrier, participants not having access to researchers, but what would it look like if we put in something that did give them access? You know, we put our email but that's not very accessible. No one's really seeing that. No one's really seeing that as an option. Like, how could we actually make ourselves accessible to participants? I don't know if I have as much of an answer from an academic standpoint. Like, community standpoint, it's like they can email me whenever. I could, you know, meet up with them in person. They can hold like an office hour type of thing where it's just like, hey, come into my Zoom room or something like that. From an academic standpoint, is that something that could be written into there? Or is that something that the IRB would be like, well, there's confidentiality, so we're not going to allow you to have these one-on-ones with participants? Like, there could be pushback to that, even that, you know, push for us to try to be more ethical in that way too.
That's right. Well, I don't know. I think one way of addressing this issue is to conduct research about these issues. We need to put these issues out there. I don't know, maybe a simple research about the composition of the ethics committee in 20 universities at 2023. I don't know how, in terms of percentage, how many of them are white, how many of them have the knowledge of the protocols that have been submitted to them and stuff. These are, I think, simple things, but at the same time, it may come with its costs, because my experience is that I haven't done any research. I wanted to do research. My experience is that they don't appreciate those types of research.
Aisha?
Yeah, you probably don't want to see me right now. It's past 10 o'clock, so I'm just going to be talking. Yeah, thanks for this session. So a few random thoughts. I wonder whether some of the questions, issues that we're struggling with have been extensively considered in other disciplines. Because I don't know, every university has their own ways of dealing with ethical applications, but where I am, for example, our applications go to science ethics committee, so we're in the science faculty. But I'm pretty sure in the social sciences and humanities, there are a lot of people that do research in developing countries with small tribes around the world. So we can't be the first people to be struggling with these issues. So I wonder whether there is something for us to learn from other social scientists and humanities colleagues. That's one thing. The other thing, also in terms of facing issues after we submit and secure ethical applications, is that it is also a little bit, the onus is on us to prepare ourselves, I think, in advance. This could be by talking to people who might have done research in similar settings, actually doing a bit of pilot interviewing, maybe with the if it is possible, of course. I mean, if you can't go back to your country or whatever, these are impossibilities. But trying to foresee some of the issues that might come up. I think that is probably it is us who have to think about these things, and when you write a research application, depending on the question, sometimes you spend a whole page talking about risk management, right? So what risks can be there? How will you then mitigate them, and so on. So I think the point I wanted to make, so my husband is a political scientist, and some of his students work in places like Colombia, and so it's a huge issue, but they have their own ways of dealing with things, and also universities sometimes are legally bound by making certain decisions. They can't, for example, send their students to locations where there's a red alarm, red risk, or whatever, right? So what you said, Nima, earlier, maybe sometimes people would be willing to take risk, but it's probably not that easy from a legal point of view. So as long as we have an affiliation and we have our salaries paid by an institution, they might have certain legal obligations towards keeping us safe. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here, but there also, in terms of doing research without ethical approval, it's not that ethics really thinks everything through and does the right things, but I could also see that this could potentially be misused. I mean, you might have the right intentions, I might have the right intentions, but some people might actually not have the right intentions, and some people going through these in advance. And some people, and you're right, has to have the right composition and the right knowledge and the experience. And if they don't, they need to be willing to find that experience and so on. So under the right conditions, somebody looking at it in advance is probably not a good idea. I mean, I have learned a great deal by people telling me, well, you haven't thought this through. You'll go there and encounter problems that you haven't thought through. So it was very, very helpful in some cases for me to be told, have you thought this? Have you considered this? If this happens, what are you going to be doing? But of course, you need the right input. Thanks.
Maybe first Shahzad, and then Nima afterwards.
Hi everyone. Hi. Yeah, I'm gonna think out loud, but something that I'm sensing in all of these talks that is coming out is this idea that there seems to be this epistemological divide between our institutions and the way they're functioning and the types of research that this group of people who are gathered here are interested in doing. So a lot of the issues that we're talking about now probably are less visible in a quantitative sort of big sample size away. And in some sense, some of the suggestions we're giving are also in some sense inapplicable because, if you care about, as quantitative psychologists do, and I'm not saying I don't have my critiques of it, I'm just trying to put all of these things together with the reality of our training and our institutions and our goal of doing a research that is more meaningful and hopefully is counter-hegemonic. So it seems like, for instance, when you do, my understanding is when you work within these interpretivist frameworks and you do more, say, qualitative research, that is when really, and that's when it becomes really visible why the information sovereignty is so important, because it's people's stories, times they spent with us. But another issue is that usually in qualitative work, or at least so my understanding after spend a year and with people who do this kind of research, is that representation doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you do a representative sample or not. You care about that community that you're doing the research with. And so it's very easy to build those relationships with that community, be in a mutual, hopefully symmetrical power relation where you collaborate on that research. But then what would happen when you come to a large sample where maybe you want to do representativeness, so are we just talking about a research that is fundamentally not about big sample, and if so, then it seems like we're back to some of the questions that, as Johanna wrote, anthropologists and, a lot of people have been dealing with, like, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but what does it mean for us, for our field that is so dominantly quantitative, big samples, and it tries to build towards that sort of research program? How do we square all of these together? I remember one of the comments we got in a project where we faced, I think Aya made the reference, was that change this to a quantitative, why this is qualitative, change this to a quantitative item, and this would resolve the issue of anonymity, confidentiality, So I'm just putting it out there. Am I just really going out of my way and philosophizing these, or is there these epistemological divide and lack of institutions and sort of paradigms that supports this type of research? Sorry, it's not a solution. I know we're on solutions, or yeah, but
no, it's always good to complicate things. Meng Yao, I don't know if your hand got tired from raising it so long. You put it down again. Did you want to? And also, Michaela, you wanted to say something before? Just want to check.
No, I lowered my hand because my question, or what I was gonna say, is going a different direction, and I thought we should first discuss what Shahada just raised.
I think that's fine. We can hold multiple thoughts at the same time. Go ahead. We can always return.
Okay.
Earlier.
Yeah. So I'm part of this project that I and Shaza were talking about, and it's been a really terrible experience with the ethics committee. And one thought I had, because I started co-chairing the diversity inclusion committee in our school, and I thought whether it would be a good idea to raise it as a diversity issue. Also going back to what Fouad and Nima were saying about the composition of the ethics committee and the lack of knowledge and experience from the committee members in dealing with these diverse contexts. I don't know, like, if that was create or generate more backlash, or that would be a viable solution, not solution, but just to raise this as a diversity issue, because I mean, the school does push for more diverse research, also push for decolonizing psychology as a field. But if the ethics committee that approves research, it's the full board, the ethics committee that reviews actually more difficult or research with more difficult ethical issues. If the committee lacks diversity, lacks the experience, knowledge to review, or are not qualified to review research in more diverse and difficult contexts, what does that mean for the research that's carrying out in the school? And also, sorry, I had another thought. I forgot where I was going. Yeah, so just yeah, whether that was and another yeah, right. I was gonna say, I also heard from my colleagues who do research on more difficult topics and in more difficult contexts that they told me that they don't think they would ever be recruited to be on the ethics committee because the committee doesn't like their types of research, and they probably would never let us be on the committee. So I think it's, yeah, I think it's inherently difficult problem, and if we do raise it as a diversity issue, that might also generate backlash.
So I definitely imagine that there is a diversity issue, and I definitely imagine that bringing up diversity never makes things worse. But I think it can also not necessarily make things better, in the sense that if in a year the same IRB has more representation in terms of, I don't know, kind of research, nationality, race, etc., I imagine that some of its evaluations might be more reasonable. But I don't think we can expect to solve this issue by having one person from every single intersection of identity in the world to be able to evaluate the research. So even if tomorrow someone, I'm just thinking of our project, someone from Turkey joins, you would still need someone from Iran to join, and then you would need someone from Lebanon to join. And if you're doing research on gender and sexuality or race, or like, it's just impossible to form an IRB that would have one person. And then also people from the same intersections disagree quite a bit, and there's the dimension of politics. So this is to say that I don't think representation is the answer. I think something with the spirit of representation, but that's structural, like a system in place where when you submit your IRB, you need to have experts on the topic write testimonies, or you need people from the community to co-write this with you. Yeah, something that allows a committee of 5 people to evaluate research that might have to do with anyone on the planet. It can definitely be phrased as a representation issue, but I would, and I don't know if you want to fight that fight with your department, but I would do it more as a long-term structure that allows a more representative evaluation rather than just more people on the team.
Fuad, keep writing in the chat box. So read Fuad's comments.
Yeah, Fuad is building on what you're suggesting. Jabua?
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying about the representation piece, because that is something that I know many people in this room probably struggle with. It's, not all skin folk are kinfolk, as we say. But it did remind me of, like, when it comes to solutions, maybe a place to learn would be a lot of disability justice advocates and organizations who really spend time specifying the difference between accessible design and universal design. So if we think about accessible design, like somebody in a wheelchair can use a specifically made a device that lifts a wheelchair up above stairs so that they can get into, and that's accessible design. But universal design is a ramp that anyone with a stroller can use, anyone who can't take steps at elevation can use. And thinking about something like that, like how many other structures do we have to work within, including IRBs, kind of lend towards that kind of accessible design, tokenization, just for you, this is your solution, versus how can we move towards a universal design approach where it's like, this is going to work for all people, and it's not going to be just specialized. So none of these, here's this amendment and here's this amendment and here's this amendment. How do we get to a structure that actually allows for all to use?
Yeah, I definitely like the ideas being mentioned here about the need for flexibility, right? That one just needs to realize we cannot anticipate all possible backgrounds, issues, etc., that will come up for the IRB review. So there needs to be some system to find people who will be able to speak to that in a given context, or build that into the process. And if the IRB itself is not built that way, we can do that work ourselves before we go out the door with the project, right? Like, again, holding ourselves to higher ethical standards. I also suggest simply, when you can, to start infiltrating IRBs at your institutions. We've definitely done some of that in response to some issues we faced, and it does make a difference, right? When you have one voice in there who starts raising these issues, that also trains people, and that then at some point becomes institutional memory. So in that way, we have been able to shift a few of those issues. For example, getting away from always requiring written consent in contexts where that wasn't reasonable, etc. Sometimes it's just a matter of norms that we can try to shape. Who else had their hand up before? I think Michaela, you had your hand up at some point.
It was also like a topic from a couple of minutes ago, but it was more into like a very specific practice that is in the line of holding ourselves accountable of our interactions with participants or with communities. And it's kind of like pushing for academic humility, and something I think people value is when your tools, I'm thinking specifically about interviews, that you actually ask, like, considering that my research is in, I don't know, social movements, and you're an activist, you're an organizer, is there something that you would have changed? Is there something that I didn't ask? Is there something that you didn't like? Which is, I mean, ideally to do that before, to pilot it. So I lowered my hand when Aisa was talking, to pilot it, to make other people see it before. But also giving the option of making that script survey some reviews from the same people that are participating on it.
Yeah, I think Aisha also mentioned this before, and some others. We're not gonna get rid of the institutional requirement of the IRB. So I think, Nima, I also wouldn't waste too much time trying to research them, because we know what the issues are, right? Like, we know lack of representation and composition, like, right? We don't need to research that. I think it's much more promising to put our energy into researching, working with our participants and with other researchers on what is actually an ethically sound, procedure, regardless of what the IRB has us do. And then kind of, separately from that, then also start working on, well, how do we deal with the bureaucracy of the IRB when these kinds of issues come up, and maybe like sharing one thing I've been doing is just collecting a bunch of articles that if someone complains that talking about collective violence and racism is harmful to people, well, then I'll send them these articles that show that, you know what, actually people do that all the time in their communities, and it even has benefits. So yes, you might not know that from your background and so on, but here's the research, right? So that's the kind of maybe crowdsourcing we can also do among each other, just how to deal with the typical kinds of responses we get, but then at the same time, thinking about what a robust ethical procedure, regardless of what the IRB does, actually looks like with our participants also. There was some hand. Oh, Nima, you had your hand up, I think.
Oh yeah, yeah, that makes sense to me, what you just said. The other perception is that at least I saw this even in this setting is, and I think it makes sense to have this perception. It's reality, social reality, that as researchers, we have our own agenda. That makes sense. We are interested in different topics. And because of that, we don't want to go just into the field or conduct the research, assuming that there is no problem, there will be no problem. I get that. It's important to have a third party to check, not necessarily the IRB, but the third party is important. But at the same time, I want to emphasize on the fact that we are, at least my experience, that we are part of the community. I don't see myself, even as a researcher, or I don't know, or as an academics, as someone who are distant in relation to the community. So I know what's going on as a member of the community. And if I don't, because physically I'm not in Iran, I have friends, students. What I want to say is that by emphasizing on the fact that we have our own agenda, we kind of disqualify ourselves to conduct the research or see ourselves as a member of the community and give ourselves some kind of credibility that I know the problems, I know the dynamics there, I know we shouldn't be doing this, we should be doing that, the risks are these, and stuff like that. So I just want to put it out there that, yeah.
All right, yeah, some people reminding us again what was said before. There's always the question of which community, so many different intersecting and also ideological issues to consider there, so we can never fully cover everything. And Michaela, with power relations, I guess you meant the power of the IRB and that kind of power that's real, or which power relations?
And also being a specific role as a faculty, student, participant, like even when you do research, people are like, oh, you're coming from NYU in my case, like that has something too. So it's like all of the layers that I think you have to kind of like think beforehand.
Yeah. And Emma supports infiltration as well, so we have that on record now. Daboa, you have your hand up, and I think that will be probably the last word.
Yeah, just real quick, and I know I'm taking a little bit of space in this meeting. Yeah, the comment on having almost trust from coming from like NYU, or like the power that comes from that. This is a whole other conversation, but especially in like predominantly white spaces, as a Black researcher, I get a lot of trust from the Black community, and as like an organizer, people know me. So as a researcher, there were contexts where I don't feel like I earned the trust of participants, but they trusted me because of certain things, and I appreciated that, you know. But at the same time, I felt like I had more of a responsibility to move ethically. If folks that don't know me personally are trusting me that easily, and they are the people who really need the most protections, really, then how do we move? So I think it's also like being part of the community means you have to be more careful with the trust that is inherent, because people want to trust you, and if you take that too lightly, then mistakes can be made, and you can potentially do a lot of harm.
Absolutely, and that speaks also to the
Absolutely.
point of accountability and how that happens naturally and organically in those contexts that we care about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. I think this was a really rich discussion. I don't know if there are any last urgent questions or comments. We have a lot also on the board. If anyone wants to have that emailed, just let me know and I can send it to you, or maybe you can even download it right now yourself. I'm not sure. Anything else to conclude? I do think it was a perfect conclusion that Jabua just, a hopeful and positive one. We always like to try to end these things on something, right? After tearing everything apart, to have something more positive and hopeful at the end. So I think that was that. Fuad, looks like you want to say something. No?
Yeah, I just want to add that this is an ongoing conversation, and if anybody wants to propose continuing the conversation, we are very happy to schedule another dilemmas session later in the year, and keep talking about this. So yeah. Anyway, I will be sending around now the links for receiving regular updates, to sign up for presentations, and as well the links for our blog site. So if you're interested in getting the updates or in proposing another session, please go ahead, and we would love to see your proposals. And thank you very much, everybody, for this very interesting conversation.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you,
Good
Johanna,
night.
for
Thank you.
for organizing this.
Thank you for putting yourself out there and doing our first session.
Sure, no worries. See you
Thank
guys.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Guys, how do people react to the messages in the chat? I keep seeing this person reacted with, how do you do that?
Hold on, let me first stop the recording.